Hello everyone, and welcome back to this discussion of Cantos 26 and 27 of the Inferno. These are two magnificent, compelling cantos in which we'll meet two larger-than-life figures. In class, I typically devote 50 minutes to each of them, so we're going to have to move quickly here to fit them into a single video, but I think we can do it, and it will be worth doing. We are still in the 8th circle of Dante's hell. The 8th circle is vast, and space is always important to Dante as a metaphor. Really, almost a third of hell is taken up by the fraudulent. There are 10 rings, that is pits or bolgia as Dante calls them. They're circular canyons dug into the ground concentrically, just as hell is a series of concentric circles. Dante and Virgil pass over them by way of bridges or dip down into them to meet the sinners. The 8th ring or bolgia of the 8th circle is reserved for the fraudulent counselors, that is, people who gave deceitful guidance or advice. Both of the characters whom we'll meet today are here for the same sin, and they are punished in the same way. That is, they're encased in a giant tongue of flame that's meant to be the inversion or the perversion of the Pentecostal flame that allowed the disciples to speak to peoples from many nations. The two figures whom we'll meet today are from both antiquity and contemporary Florence. They are part of both a fiction and a history. The one is the Greek warrior Ulysses, renowned from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The other is the contemporary of Dante, Guido da Montefeltro. Very quickly in Canto 26, you get the sense that something is slightly different. Dante approaches this vast canyon, he looks over, and he sees all of the flames below. But instead of registering their torture or their agony, he uses a simile that compares them to a valley of fireflies at dusk. It's a beautiful, pastoral, serene metaphor, and I think you have seen this kind of thing before. That is, Dante is using a metaphor, the landscape, to set up a kind of privileged or special place to speak with the souls, to ennoble them, to give them a sort of pride and a sort of grandeur that may not actually be theirs in this infernal place, but that he nonetheless wants to lend them momentarily. Not unlike when the storm seemed to pause just enough for Paolo and Francesca to come and speak with him. For comparison, you need only look at the introduction to Canto 27, which Dante begins by discussing the Sicilian bull, an instrument of torture, an empty bronze bull in which a tyrant would place and roast alive his victims. Dante compares the speaking of the individual souls to the screams of these victims from within that bronze bull, in order to convey something of the great torture that they undergo just to exist and to speak as they're doing now. You don't get a lot of that sense of agony and suffering in Canto 26. Dante's Ulysses is epic and heroic. The canto is written in an Italian that is high and noble. That's Dante's attempt to kind of replicate the patterns of great epics of classical antiquity. Virgil suggests that he speak because his speech, being that of an ancient Roman, will be more fitting. Remember, Dante did not read Homer's Odyssey or the Iliad in the original Greek. He knew about Ulysses, that's the Latin form of Odysseus, through Latin sources, which portrayed the ancient Greek hero as a great adventurer, yes, but also as a cheat, as a liar, as an untrustworthy strategist and swindler. So why is Ulysses here? Why is he in the 8th circle? Well, it's not altogether clear. Virgil offers a number of possibilities, one of which is the great deceit, the kind of paradigmatic deceit of the ancient world, and that is the episode of the Trojan horse. As you know, the 10-year-long Trojan War ended when Odysseus and the Greeks feigned retreat, but actually hid inside of a giant wooden horse, which the Trojans then, believing that the Greeks had gone, pulled inside of the city, and at night the Greeks came out and slaughtered them. Virgil says of Ulysses and Diomedes, there, together in that flame, they grieve over the horse's fraud. It's actually less important, though, why Ulysses is here than the story that he tells about his death. This is what interests the pilgrim most, and it's also what interests the poet most, because the poet comes up with an entirely new narrative. Dante, in fact, takes this great ancient epic hero and writes a new chapter in his story to fit the purposes of the Commedia. In the Odyssey, Odysseus returns home after 10 years at war and another 10 years of being lost at sea and attempting to find his way home. In Dante's version, Ulysses says, "Nothing after I returned, nothing, not love of my son, not care for my aging father, not love of Penelope, could hold me back from that voyaging and adventuring to which I had grown accustomed." So Dante's Ulysses sets out again after he has returned. He sails with his old and tired crew beyond the farthest reaches of the known world, the Pillars of Hercules, and when they grow afraid that perhaps they've gone too far, that's when Ulysses gives his great speech. At line 112, he says, "Brothers, O you who have crossed 1,000 dangers, you must not deny the experience of what lies beyond the sun, and of the world that is unpeopled. Consider well the seed that gave you birth. You were not made to live your lives as brutes, but to be followers of worth and knowledge." It's a tremendous and persuasive speech. All of his crewmates are compelled to follow his path, but the voyage ends in catastrophe. As they all approach a giant dark mountain, larger than he has ever seen, a storm batters the ship, whirls it about 3 times, and sinks it, killing them all. It's difficult to see at first, but once you recognize it, you'll never be able to unsee it. Ulysses is Dante's double, his doppelganger in the Commedia. Ulysses tells his men that they must see the world beyond the sun, the unpeopled world. And that's precisely what the pilgrim is doing. Ulysses chooses exile over homecoming. Dante is forced into exile, but he too, later in the Commedia, will find a way to make it a choice, to privilege exile as a state of being that is chosen and that will lead him eventually to heaven. And in this canto, Dante, in fact, before he meets the shades, the poet says, more than usual here, I have to rein in my imagination. I have to be careful that it does not go off course. And he uses metaphors that are precisely those that Ulysses uses in describing his voyage. So the voyage of the poem is similar to the voyage that the pilgrim in the poem takes, is similar to the voyage that Ulysses takes. Readers are therefore left to interpret just how much Dante admires Ulysses, just how much he fears his fate, just how much as readers we're meant to believe, in fact, in the speech that he gives. One thing we can say is that Ulysses does not humble himself and take a guide to go on this magnificent journey. Instead, he rouses his shipmates and goes in the name of wisdom and of experience, rather than, as the pilgrim does in the narrative, humbling himself, following Virgil, and going in the name of freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom from error, freedom to reach the divine. But it's really less the pilgrim that we're concerned with here and the poet. The poet who knows that his gambit is to write this journey, is to create an adventure, a fiction, a magnificent universe that may just go too far. Just as with Geryon, we are faced here, Dante is faced here, with the possibility of going past that point where he should otherwise stop. My final point in this canto is something that will really blow your mind, which is to realize that the giant mountain that seems to rise out of the sea as Ulysses and his shipmates journey towards it is none other than the mountain of purgatory. He has reached the very foot of the mountain that Dante, the pilgrim, and Virgil will climb in the next book. Dante will, in the narrative, make it past the point that defeated the great Ulysses. Canto 27 is moving and compelling in such different ways. It's a canto of low language, whereas 26 was a canto of high language. It's a canto of trickery, deceit, and politics, whereas 26 seemed to be full of epic grandeur, military strategy, and adventure. Here Dante meets Guido da Montefeltro, a knight and a military strategist who was known in Italy for his cunning and his ruthlessness. Having grown old, Guido da Montefeltro abandons this life of the military strategist, taking up now as a Franciscan friar, that is, taking his vows and adopting the life of a religious man. One of the questions that his language forces us to ask is how authentic his conversion was, or whether it was simply yet another one of his strategies, this time to make it to heaven. At line 84, he says something that might be translated as, "Oh, that it would have worked," or "Oh, that it might have helped," as if he had been so close to his desired goal. The story that he tells is this. After he became a cleric, he was visited by none other than our friend Pope Boniface VIII. You'll remember Boniface VIII. He's the one who, in 1302, supported the coup that resulted in Dante's exile, and he's also the one whom Dante predestined to hell before his death, back up in the third Bolgia with the Simonists. Now, Boniface is a pope, but that doesn't stop him from waging war on a rival family close by in Italy. This large family and their military is held up in a fortress at Palestrina, and he can't get them out. He comes to Guido de Montefeltro to solicit his advice on how to win the war, and he promises him remission or removal of his sins in advance. "Don't you know," he says, "I have two keys, one that locks and one that unlocks?" Some scholars see this as a promise. I can unlock the gate of heaven, but they also see it as a threat. If you don't do what I want, Boniface implies, I can lock you out of heaven. In any case, Guido de Montefeltro, the great strategist and schemer, is himself persuaded here. He says, "The highest priest, may he be damned," referring to Boniface, "made me fall back into my former sins. His grave arguments compelled me, so my silence seemed a worse offense than speech." Guido de Montefeltro gives him advice, which is in essence to promise a truce, but then renege on it. And in fact, that's what Boniface does, resulting in his victory in the battle and in further bloodshed and violence. So things end up well for Boniface, but not particularly well for Guido de Montefeltro. So one thing to note is that the end of this fraudulent council isn't simply a political victory. It's violence, it's bloodshed, it's warfare. In contrast to the ending of the previous canto, which had a kind of epic grandeur, the catastrophe, the sea closed over us, Canto 27 ends on a somewhat comedic note. St. Francis himself comes to collect Guido de Montefeltro's soul. He was a Franciscan, so he suggests that Francis himself comes to get him when he dies. But he is stopped, Dante says, by a devil who says, "No way, you can't cheat me of what is mine. This soul I've been keeping an eye on." In essence, the devil says it's logically impossible to both repent a thing and do the thing at the same time. Repentance requires a regret for doing a thing, the wish that it not be done, but doing the thing requires, in fact, the opposite, the wish that it be done. His triumphal boast, the devil's that is in fact an insult to Francis and to the Franciscans. "Perhaps you didn't think," he says, "the devil was a logician." Guido de Montefeltro is a much different character than Ulysses, but no less compelling for that. As readers, we must carefully interpret his every word, just as with Ulysses, just as with the previous sinners, to grasp how he deceives himself and us, blaming everything, as he does, on other factors, especially on Boniface VIII, whom he says came to him as if he were in a fever. And it's at that moment that we recall how Francesca blamed love, how Pierre blamed envy, how each shade is in fact incapable of seeing alternatives and of seeing the other forces at work, including their own choices that led to their downfall. The poet's treatment of Guido de Montefeltro, his portrayal of him here, has a somewhat retroactive effect even on the previous canto. That is, it kind of lets us see the dangers of this sin without the glossy varnish that set the Ulysses canto apart and aside. In essence, he asks us to see what fraudulent counsel really is about, its real consequences, how it leads to death and violence and mistrust, and how those who practice it are ultimately caught up as well in their own webs of self-deception and lies.